So we're going to move on to rhetorical devices. So rhetorical are used in speeches and public speaking a lot. So technically politicians should use them, but they don't really because they're not that well taught nowadays, or they're a bit rubbish. But traditionally, proper politicians and public speakers used to use a ton of rhetorical devices because they're really powerful, persuasive techniques that capture your attention. So there are some basic rhetorical devices, things like repetition or tripartite structure / rule of three. They're rhetorical devices. But the more advanced ones are very difficult to remember the name of, but very effective, as you'll see. Some of these, I'm not even 100% sure how to pronounce them, but I don't think you need to strictly be able to pronounce them just to talk about them in analysis or use them in your writing. So even though rhetorical devices are used in speaking, you can get your characters to use them because if you're writing dialogue, then that is speech basically. Or you can use them in your description anyway because they do have a powerful kind of effect, especially quite often a good structural effect. So I'll have a look at a few. So the first one, I think it's pronounced Litotes. Litotes. I did look it up on YouTube how to pronounce this one, but I think there's like 3 different pronunciations. Not sure. It's a Greek word, so in my mind that should be Litotes or Litotes. Anyway, another name for it is understatement, and the idea is it's the opposite of hyperbole, which is exaggeration. Hyperbole is a different rhetorical device that you should know. And yeah, you downplay the importance of something or the drama. So you minimize drama by using kind of tentative negative phrasing or double negatives. So it's using double negatives, but they're kind of not really quite cancelling each other out. They're just creating a sort of unemotional or kind of lowered emotion or mood. And it's also a type of verbal irony. So if you're interested in types of irony, which you should be if you're trying to write at an advanced level, this is one kind of verbal irony. So a few examples. That was no ordinary school day. So probably it was a very weird school day, but you're downplaying the importance of it by just saying it wasn't ordinary. It's probably highly unusual rather than just a bit weird, but the way that you phrase it is a kind of understatement. Double detention wasn't too bad in the end. Every time we say not too bad, that's an example of litotes. So if something is not too bad, it means it's not good. It's very weird, isn't it, the way that we say that? It means it's not exactly good, but it's not as bad as you thought it could be. So again, understatement, downplaying any kind of extreme emotion. And another example, the weather was far from ideal. So instead of saying the weather was bad, we're just saying far from ideal, which also means bad, but it's kind of a roundabout, understated type way of saying it. So you can pause if you like and have a go at litotes, and then we'll move on to the next rhetorical device. So antithesis then is, I actually did mention it a little minute ago anyway, but it's basically an idea that you have two opposite concepts placed directly next to each other, and it sort of throws those concepts into sharp contrast if you place them directly together. So it's similar to juxtaposition, but juxtaposition is more broad. That can just be like any two seemingly non-fitting things, whereas antithesis is specifically opposites. So we have a few examples here. I love donuts, but I hate cookies. It's not really that donuts and cookies are opposite, it's more like love one thing, hate the other. So the love and hate is the antithesis there, not the donuts and cookies. I know I highlighted those. The girl sang beautifully, but her small voice was drowned out by shouts and applause. So there's an antithesis going on there because her voice is very quiet and the shouts and applause are loud. So this sort of like has to be two things in the same category, but also opposite at the same time, if you see what I mean. Like they're both noises, the voice of the girl and the voice of the shouts and applause, the sound of the shouts and applause, but they're opposite in terms of quality. So small and beautiful versus loud and coarse. So antithesis, really good range of possibilities with that technique. I use it loads in my writing, I think. It's just really effective and it's quite fun to do. It is hard to get your head around at first, so I recommend practicing that one. I think the most famous antithesis ever is, when, what's he called? Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon and he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." That's small step versus giant leap. That's a type of antithesis. So you do see it a lot in kind of famous public speeches. Yeah, so you can pause now and have a go at trying that one. So we're going to move to this one, which I love. I only found out about it this year because one of my students used it in a piece of Shakespeare analysis, and I was like, whoa, what is Epizeuxis? Because it just sounds crazy. It's actually the easiest technique ever, and there's no excuse for not getting this one in. It shouldn't even really be an advanced writing technique apart from no one knows about it and no one can actually pronounce it. I don't even know if Epizeuxis is right, to be honest, but it's a very good technique. So it means repeating a word several times directly after each other for a specific effect, normally quite an emotional, kind of intense effect, often to show anxiety or panic or anger, shock, that kind of thing. And if you are studying Shakespeare at some point, notice how much he uses this all the time. It's like in every single one of his plays, I swear. So, my example is very easy. No, 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 and get out, out. So you can just see repeated word. You don't call it repetition because repetition is very broad and general as a term. So when you're going into advanced techniques, you want to try and break it up into what actual specific kind of repetition is it? Is it anaphora? Is it epizeuxis? Is it rhyme of some kind? Is it motif? There's all sorts of different types of repetition. So epizeuxis is a much more specific term to use. So you can pause and have a go at doing that very easy one. The only thing is, even though it's easy to do, you do have to use it with the right effects in mind. So that's the same with any writing technique. Make sure that you're using it in a way that actually enhances the meaning of what you're saying. You're not just chucking it in for the sake of it. And you should do that with all of these techniques anyway. So you can pause, have a go at epizeuxis, and then we'll move on to this next crazy one. So this one, Anacoluthon, disrupting the grammatical flow of a sentence for effect. And if you're someone who reads books, which you should be if you want to be a writer, or even if you're writing for the sake of taking an exam, read, because it'll just help you. I'm just using epizeuxis everywhere now because it's fun. read. Yeah, so you'll notice anyway with Anacoluthon that writers use this a lot, and it's very like writing styley type technique to use, although it can be used in speech as well quite effectively. I was reading The Hobbit to someone the other day, J.R. Tolkien, the guy who did Lord of the Rings. Really, really good book if you've not read it. I recommend it. And I was just reading the first couple of pages, and he's sort of going on about hobbits and what they are and how they live and kind of personality they have. And then halfway through the sentence, he uses Anacoluthon and he stops himself and he says, "What is a hobbit? I suppose I should explain." So he's kind of been going on about hobbits for about 3 paragraphs non-stop, and then he suddenly realizes that the audience is not actually going to know what this word is because he's just made this word up. So then he actually explains what they are and the history of them a little bit. So so you get it in all sorts of places with writing. These are my examples. That happened a long time ago, before he was, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. And as I was saying, oh wait, I forgot my point. So you need the sentence starts one way, then there's a pause, usually indicated by a dash, as you can see. This long dash I prefer actually, this one. That's my personal preference for this type of technique, not this short dash. And yeah, you can see that it just ends differently from how you expect, and it disrupts the flow of the sentence halfway through. And that kind of has a few different effects. So it creates anticipation with the first one, especially because it's like before he was what? You want to know what was he before, or what is he now that he wasn't then? And then it kind of doesn't give you that information. So it makes the reader want to read on because there's information to be known that we aren't given. So it's sort of frustrating, but in a pleasant way. And then the second example here, as I was saying, oh wait, I forgot my point. It creates a sort of digression, or it creates a disruption, but it also feels quite natural because people do that in real life. So it's a good example of natural dialogue. So yeah, a whole host of ways to use Anacoluthon, and I recommend it. It's a very good writing style technique, and it creates a nice narrative voice if you use that type of technique. So you can pause now and have a go at your own piece of Anacoluthon, and then we'll move on to the last rhetorical device. So periphrasis is sometimes also called euphuistic diction. I'll just type that in. Euphuistic. Yeah, I think they're the same thing. Double check definitions of those to make sure. But to me, when I was doing my A-level literature analysis, we sort of called it euphuistic diction, but it's also called periphrasis. And a really good example of this is in Hamlet. There's a character called Polonius who's a really annoying dad, basically. He's like Ophelia's dad. And yeah, he's a real weak pain. And Hamlet accidentally kills him eventually. Well, in the middle. I'm not really ruining the plot for you because it happens quite early on. But the guy, one of the things that's super annoying about him is he just takes forever to explain something that's very, very clear or like simple. He'll just take forever because he wants to sound clever and intelligent, and he's clearly stupid. So it's sort of like a running joke that he uses all this fancy vocabulary and he speaks for ages, but the content of what he's actually saying is very little. And yeah, and it's kind of interesting because Shakespeare's using that deliberately to sort of make the point that people who talk in fancy language aren't necessarily intelligent people. They're just educated, or they think that it sounds good to talk like that. So that's one way to use periphrasis, to kind of expose um, a character who thinks too much of themselves as actually quite stupid when they seem kind of pompous and superior. And then I've got a couple of other ways of using it here that I've given in my own examples. So the first one, in my opinion, I think that what we really should be doing is maybe fire someone. You could shorten that to just fire someone, really. You don't need all of that, but it suggests that the person saying this is not really comfortable with the idea of firing someone. So they're taking a long time to say it to sort of soften the blow of what they're saying. Maybe it's a difficult thing for them to speak, so they ramble a lot. So yeah, it's effective that way, and it is realistic to everyday life because when people have difficult things that they want to say, generally they're not very direct about it, and they do use periphrasis. They ramble and sort of go off on a tangent and eventually get round to the point that they actually intended. And then the second one is a slightly different use of periphrasis. The homework feedback said there's room for improvement and to focus more on the question and task at hand. But what the teacher really meant was it's a D. So it gives you the example of what they mean versus what they say. It's kind of slightly humorous because it's imitating teacher speak, and that's kind of how teachers always deal with stuff like this. But it's an example of periphrasis because it's not clear and short and to the point and direct. It's rambling and kind of long-winded and quite vague, using a lot more words than necessary. So take you a little while, I think, to get your head around this technique and to get comfortable using it. So I recommend practicing it a few times and thinking about different ways in which you can apply it to your work. You might have a character that speaks this way. You might want to use it in your description somehow. There's, as you can see, loads of different effects. So I want you to just experiment with this one and play around with the different effects of periphrasis. So you can pause now and have a go at that, or you can do it at a later date. Depends how many of these you've done and how tired you are by this point. That's the last rhetorical device. So we're going to move on to narrative devices, and there's only a few more of these.